There comes a moment, quiet, unexpected, almost invisible, when the person who walked away from you begins to feel your absence in ways they never prepared for. Not when you chase them, not when you prove your worth, but when you finally choose yourself, something shifts. The silence you create becomes louder than your words ever were. And in that silence, they begin to see you clearly, maybe for the first time. This is the moment they start to revalue you. And it has nothing to do with what you say, and everything to do with who you become. There is a divine law at work in human connection that most people misunderstand. The more you chase, the more you lose yourself. And the more you lose yourself, the less value others unconsciously place on you. But the moment you return to your center, your truth, your dignity, your peace, you activate silent power. A power that does not beg, does not explain, does not convince. It simply is. When someone with an avoidant nature walks away, it is rarely because you lacked value. It is because your presence demanded a level of emotional depth they were not prepared to meet. So they distance themselves, not always out of malice, but out of discomfort. They convince themselves that leaving is freedom, that detaching is strength, that forgetting you will be easy. But what they fail to understand is this: the human heart does not operate on logic alone. It remembers what felt rare. It remembers what felt rare. And here is where the shift begins. The exact moment they start to revalue you is not when you remind them of your worth. It is when you stop reminding them altogether. When your energy is no longer reaching for them, when your attention is no longer feeding their sense of control, when your life begins to move forward without their presence, something inside them begins to stir. Because now, for the first time, they are experiencing you the way you once experienced them, distant, unavailable, and uncertain. This is not a game. This is a mirror. And mirrors have a way of revealing truths we try to avoid. When you detach, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, you reclaim something sacred, your emotional independence. You are no longer waiting, hoping, analyzing their every move. You are no longer shrinking yourself to fit into their comfort zone. Instead, you rise, quietly, powerfully, authentically. And that transformation cannot be ignored. Avoidant individuals are deeply sensitive to shifts in energy, even if they cannot articulate it. When you stop chasing, they feel it. When you stop needing, they notice it. When you stop reacting, they question it. Because now, the dynamic has changed. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer accessible. You are no longer theirs to return to whenever it suits them. And in that loss of certainty, your value increases. Not because you became someone new, but because you stopped giving away what was always precious. Your presence, your attention, your love, without reciprocity. There is also a deeper, more spiritual principle at play. What is freely given is often taken for granted, but what is no longer available becomes meaningful. Not because it changed, but because perception changed. When they had you, they saw comfort. When they lost you, they begin to see significance. But understand this clearly, this revaluation is not always conscious. It often shows up as curiosity, as checking in, as subtle attempts to reconnect, as confusion about why they suddenly feel what they once suppressed. And here is where your wisdom must guide you. Because the purpose of your growth was never to make them return. The purpose was to make you whole. If they come back, it should not be because you waited. It should be because you evolved, beyond needing them. Because now you are not the same person they left. You are grounded, you are aware, you are aligned with your worth. And from that place, you no longer seek validation. You embody it. So the real transformation is not in them. It is in you. The moment you stop abandoning yourself to hold on to someone else is the moment everything changes. Energy shifts, perception shifts. Even the people who once overlooked you begin to feel your absence like a missing piece they cannot quite replace. But by then, you are no longer the person waiting to be chosen. You are the one who chooses. And that is the ultimate power. There comes a point in every emotional journey where you realize that holding on is no longer an act of love, but an act of self-abandonment. This is the moment where the shift truly begins, not when the other person changes, not when they come back, not when they finally understand your worth, but when you make a quiet, internal decision to reclaim your energy. Emotional detachment is not about becoming cold or indifferent. It is about becoming whole again. When you were attached, your energy was constantly flowing outward. Your thoughts revolved around them. Your emotions were influenced by their actions, their silence, their inconsistency. You gave your attention freely, hoping it would create connection, hoping it would be enough to make them stay, to make them see, to make them see, to make them feel. But in doing so, you slowly disconnected from yourself. You began to measure your worth based on their responses. You started to feel anxious, uncertain, even restless in your own space. Detachment is the moment you interrupt that pattern. It happens quietly. There is no dramatic announcement, no final speech, just a deep internal awareness that says, I deserve peace more than I deserve confusion. And from that awareness, your behavior begins to change. You stop checking your phone with urgency. You stop overanalyzing every word they said or didn't say. You stop trying to decode their silence. Instead, you begin to redirect that energy inward. You start asking yourself different questions. Not why are they like this, but why did I tolerate this? Not how can I fix this, but what do I truly need to feel fulfilled? This is where your power returns. Because the focus is no longer on changing them. It is on understanding yourself. As you reclaim your energy, something remarkable happens. Your presence becomes less accessible, not because you are playing games, but because you are no longer available for emotional inconsistency. You begin to set boundaries, not loudly, not aggressively, but firmly. You choose not to engage in situations that drain you. You choose not to entertain behaviors that diminish your self-worth. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift. The person who once felt your constant emotional availability now feels a void. The space you used to fill with your attention, your care, your effort, it is no longer there, and that absence speaks louder than anything you ever said, because what they once took for granted is no longer being given freely. But understand this deeply. This is not about making them feel your absence. That is a byproduct, not the purpose. The purpose is your liberation. The purpose is your alignment with a higher standard of self-respect. When you detach, you are not rejecting them. You are choosing yourself. There is a divine principle in this. What you cling to in fear will often slip away, but what you release with trust creates space for something greater. Emotional detachment is an act of trust. Trust that your peace matters. Trust that your value is not dependent on anyone's recognition. Trust that what is meant for you will not require you to lose yourself to keep it. And in that space of detachment, you begin to rediscover who you are without the weight of their inconsistency. You feel lighter, clearer, stronger. You are no longer reacting. You are responding. You are no longer chasing. You are attracting. This is the moment everything begins to change, even if you cannot yet see it. There is a hidden power in absence, a force that cannot be manufactured or forced. Presence can be overwhelming, subtle, and even unnoticed at times, but absence has a clarity all its own. When you are constantly present, physically, emotionally, or mentally, the other person may not see the depth of your value. Familiarity can breed complacency, and even the most perceptive individuals can overlook what they always have within reach. But absence creates perspective. It is in the space you leave behind that truth begins to emerge, unfiltered and undeniable. Absence is not simply leaving a room or stepping back from communication. It is a conscious choice to honor your own needs, to create distance between your emotional energy and the influence of someone else's behavior. When you withdraw, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, you allow reality to be seen without distortion. The mind and heart, when deprived of what they once relied upon, begin to process, to reflect, to evaluate. They notice what they took for granted, and the contrast between your presence and your absence becomes stark. This is why absence is so transformative in human relationships. It forces reflection. The person who once assumed your attention as constant begins to realize it is not infinite. They start to perceive the boundaries you have set, the emotional space you now occupy for yourself, rather than for them. In that silence, in that space between interactions, they are left with their own thoughts, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes enlightening. They see what they lost not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible gap in their life, a void where your energy and presence once were. Absence also communicates something words cannot. It speaks of self-sufficiency, of dignity, of independence. You are no longer chasing approval, seeking validation, or reacting to every emotional impulse they provoke. You are living your life, and they cannot control it, manipulate it, or occupy it the way they once could. And this is what creates this shift, the revaluation. When someone who is avoidant senses that you are no longer available to be managed or influenced, their perception of your value changes. The qualities they once overlooked, the kindness, the stability, the depth, the authenticity, become visible precisely because they can no longer be taken for granted. But absence is not about punishment. It is about clarity. It is about creating a mirror through which others see reality, even if that reality is uncomfortable. And in that discomfort, they begin to reconcile with what they ignored when it was easy, and they begin to question what they let slip away. The clarity of absence does what presence never could. It removes the illusions, the assumptions, and the habitual taking for granted. It forces consciousness, and consciousness always precedes revaluation. Most importantly, the power of absence lies in its alignment with your own growth. You are not absent to manipulate, but to nurture yourself. You are not absent to incite jealousy, but to cultivate peace. You are absent to honor the sacredness of your own energy, your time, your emotional availability. And in doing so, you create an environment in which the other person's understanding, their awareness, and their perception inevitably shift. Not because you demand it, but because truth always finds its way into recognition. Absence, therefore, is not empty. It is full of wisdom, purpose, and transformative potential. It is the soil in which revaluation takes root, and when that seed sprouts, it will not be a reflection of your need, but a reflection of your power. There is a subtle but undeniable truth about human nature. People often only recognize the value of what they cannot have. The avoidant personality is no exception. When someone with avoidant tendencies distances themselves, it is rarely because the other person lacks worth. In fact, it is often precisely because they sense the depth of that worth depth they are not prepared to meet or sustain. Their avoidance is a defense, a way to manage the discomfort of intimacy, emotional intensity, or vulnerability. Yet paradoxically, this very distance creates the conditions for revaluation. They begin to revalue, not because you changed who you are, but because you are no longer available to them in the ways they once expected. The mechanism of revaluation is deeply psychological. Avoidants are wired to fear engulfment, dependence, or loss of autonomy. When they discard someone, they are attempting to preserve a sense of control, to protect themselves from perceived vulnerability. But humans are social beings, and our minds are designed to notice absence, scarcity, and the loss of connection. When you step back, when you withdraw your energy, and stop participating in the patterns that once made you predictable and accessible, a subtle tension arises. This tension triggers reflection, whether conscious or unconscious. They notice the qualities they once overlooked, the warmth, the empathy, the consistency, the authenticity. They begin to sense that what they walked away from is not something they can easily replace. Avoidants revalue most strongly when they perceive that your presence is no longer within reach. The sense of inaccessibility awakens curiosity and desire. They begin to question the decisions they made, the assumptions they held, and the boundaries you now embody. What they once dismissed as ordinary or taken for granted becomes extraordinary precisely because it is no longer guaranteed. In this process, your worth is not created by their recognition. It was always inherent, but the perception of that worth shifts dramatically in their mind. Scarcity is not about your absence alone. It is about the awareness that what you offer is no longer freely available to fulfill their emotional expectations. This principle is mirrored in life repeatedly. The value of a sunrise is fully appreciated when we travel far to see it. The sweetness of water is most noticed when we are thirsty. Similarly, your emotional and personal qualities, your time, your attention, your energy, are often most clearly recognized when they are not immediately accessible. Avoidants, in their avoidance, confront a paradox. The very distance they create to protect themselves triggers a growing awareness of the depth and significance of what they have lost. Yet this revaluation is not about coercion or manipulation. It is a natural response to reality. When you cease to overextend yourself, cease to chase validation, and begin living fully in alignment with your own values, your worth is reflected back to the other person in a new light. They begin to see the richness of what they once discarded. And in that seeing, they are confronted with a truth that words alone could never convey, that your value was never conditional, and that what they once left behind is worth far more than they imagined. This is the quiet, almost invisible magic of human perception. Avoidants revalue, not because you changed for them, but because you stopped being the version of yourself that existed solely to fit their expectations. Your authenticity, your independence, and your self-respect shine most brightly when they are unclaimed, untethered, and unapologetically whole. Growth is not a linear path. It is a series of subtle transformations that ripple through every aspect of your being. When you evolve emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, it alters not only how you see yourself, but also how others perceive you. In the context of someone avoidant, your growth becomes an undeniable force that disrupts their established perception of you. For years, they may have viewed you through a lens shaped by their own limitations, perhaps seeing you as predictable, available, or dependent on their presence. But as you grow, that lens begins to crack, and the image they once held no longer fits reality. Growth manifests in countless ways, through increased self-awareness, improved boundaries, emotional stability, and a deeper sense of purpose. It is evident in the way you carry yourself, the choices you make, and the energy you radiate. You are no longer defined by their actions or reactions. You define yourself by your own standards, guided by principles that are rooted in wisdom rather than fear. This transformation is magnetic, yet it is also unsettling for someone who once relied on your accessibility. Avoidants are accustomed to certain dynamics, and your evolution interrupts those dynamics. Suddenly, you are no longer the person who bends to their emotional rhythms. You are no longer waiting, hoping, or overextending to fill gaps that are theirs to navigate. The disruption is not about control or strategy. It is a natural consequence of self-alignment. When you begin to prioritize your growth, your time, and your energy, you inherently alter the relational equilibrium. The avoidant individual, who once felt a sense of predictability or dominance, now encounters someone who is self-contained and self-fulfilled. Your confidence, your peace, and your joy, derived from your own development rather than external validation, create a mirror in which they are forced to see themselves differently. They notice what they cannot have as easily: the depth of your emotional intelligence, the steadiness of your boundaries, and the clarity of your intentions. Growth also communicates a message that words cannot, that you are not dependent on their recognition or approval to thrive. The way you hold your life, your presence, and your choices signals that you have transcended the need for validation from someone who once discarded you. Avoidants, who often fear emotional intensity or closeness, are confronted with a reality they did not anticipate. The person they underestimated or took for granted now stands firm, whole, and unshakable. This shift compels revaluation. They are drawn to the authenticity and strength they previously ignored. Your growth highlights what they missed, what they dismissed, and what they cannot replicate. And yet, the power of growth is subtle. It does not demand attention. It radiates quietly but unmistakably. You do not need to explain, prove, or justify your evolution. Your life becomes the testament. The energy of someone who has truly grown is impossible to ignore, and for an avoidant, it becomes a silent but profound call to reconsider what they once discarded. Ultimately, your growth is not about making them revalue you. It is about embodying your truth so fully that anyone observing, consciously or unconsciously, recognizes your worth. The moment of revaluation is simply a byproduct of your transformation. It is the reflection of your integrity, your self-respect, and your authenticity shining in ways that cannot be overlooked. Growth is not just about who you become. It is about how the universe, and even those who once left, inevitably respond to the power of your alignment. There is a quiet power in emotional self-sufficiency, a strength that often goes unnoticed until it is confronted by someone who once relied on your availability. Emotional self-sufficiency is not about isolation or detachment from life. It is about cultivating a state of inner completeness where your peace, your happiness, and your sense of worth are no longer contingent upon another person's presence or validation. When you achieve this, you step into a place of authority over your own emotional world, and that authority shifts the dynamics of every relationship you are in, especially with someone avoidant. Avoidant individuals are drawn to patterns they can predict and control. When you exist in a state of emotional dependence, they unconsciously feel a sense of stability. They know how to navigate your needs, how to trigger reactions, and even how to maintain distance without consequence. But the moment you stop relying on them to complete you, that structure begins to crumble. Your energy no longer revolves around their moods, their approval, or their attention. You do not seek reassurance, explanations, or validation from them because you have created your own internal framework of self-worth. This is where the subtle yet undeniable shift occurs, the shift that leads to revaluation. Emotional self-sufficiency communicates something profound without a single word. It signals that you are whole on your own, that your joy is not borrowed, that your presence is a choice rather than a need. For an avoidant who fears being entangled or having to meet emotional intensity, this is both intriguing and challenging. They sense a depth and stability that they cannot easily influence or predict. Suddenly, you are no longer the person who waits, chases, or compromises themselves to maintain connection. You are autonomous, grounded, and unshakable. This independence illuminates your value in a way that presence never could, because it reframes their perception. They begin to see what they once overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed. Self-sufficiency also sets a boundary that is impossible to ignore. You are no longer giving your energy freely in ways that reinforce their comfort at your expense. Instead, you offer attention, care, and connection selectively, guided by choice rather than obligation. Your emotional economy becomes your own, and in doing so, you create scarcity, not as a tool of manipulation, but as a natural consequence of honoring your own needs. Avoidants respond to the scarcity with heightened awareness. When your energy is no longer an open channel for them to occupy or manage, they begin to recognize the value that was always present but never fully appreciated. Moreover, Emotional self-sufficiency cultivates inner peace and clarity. When you are complete within yourself, you are no longer reactive. You respond from a place of groundedness rather than need. Your decisions are based on alignment with your own principles, not on fear of abandonment or desire for approval. This presence of mind and stability radiates outward, subtly compelling the avoidant to confront the reality that the dynamic has changed. The patterns they once relied upon to maintain distance or control are no longer effective, and the person they underestimated is now fully whole. Ultimately, emotional self-sufficiency is transformative because it forces recognition without words. It demonstrates, through action and presence, that your value is inherent, unwavering, and independent. The revaluation occurs naturally, not because you demanded it, but because the universe has aligned your energy with your truth. You no longer wait to be chosen. You have chosen yourself, and in that act, everything shifts. The final key to understanding the exact moment an avoidant begins to revalue you lies in the recognition that this shift is rarely about you convincing them of your worth. It is about their internal conflict. Revaluation is an internal process, a confrontation with their own unresolved emotions, fears, and limitations. It is not triggered by words, by displays of affection, or by attempts to persuade. It is triggered by a truth they cannot escape, that you exist independently, fully, and without need for their approval. This truth challenges everything they believed about the relationship and about themselves, and it is this confrontation that awakens their awareness. Avoidants often operate with defense mechanisms that protect them from emotional intensity. They detach, distance, and sometimes discard, all to preserve a sense of control and autonomy. When they do so, they create a narrative in which your worth becomes secondary and their need for space becomes paramount. Yet, this narrative is not always sustainable. Humans are wired to notice value, to recognize significance, and to feel absence. When you are no longer emotionally available, no longer reacting to their patterns, and no longer allowing their avoidance to dictate your state, a subtle tension forms. This tension is not about you, it is about them confronting the reality of what they allowed themselves to lose. The internal conflict manifests in many ways. They may feel curiosity, longing, or even confusion. They notice the way your presence, or rather the absence of it, illuminates what they overlooked. It is as if the world suddenly appears in sharper focus the qualities they dismissed. Your authenticity, your compassion, your stability, your clarity now emerge as undeniable, irreplaceable elements of your being. The difference is not that you changed. The difference is that they are now forced to perceive reality without the filter of predictability, control, or habitual disregard. This process also reveals a profound psychological principle. People often value most what they cannot control. Avoidants are uniquely sensitive to shifts in emotional accessibility. When you cease to be available on demand, when your energy is no longer aligned with their attempts to maintain distance or dominance, they are confronted with their own limitations. They realize that the person they once dismissed is now outside their influence. This realization is uncomfortable, but discomfort often precedes clarity. It is the friction between their desire for control and their growing awe, recognition of your value, that sparks the internal shift known as revaluation. It is critical to understand that this revaluation is not a measure of your power over them, but a reflection of your alignment with yourself. You did not manipulate, chase, or force recognition. You simply existed fully, independently, and with integrity. In doing so, you illuminated the contrast between what was ignored and what is now undeniable. Their internal conflict, their cognitive and emotional awakening, is a mirror of your steadfastness, your consistency, and your refusal to shrink for their comfort. Ultimately, the exact moment of revaluation is never about external validation. It is about their internal reckoning. They are confronted with the truth of what they walked away from, the reality of your value, and the impossibility of reclaiming it on their terms. And this reckoning, while born of absence and detachment, is a testament to your power to transform through presence within yourself. You no longer wait for recognition because your worth has always existed independently. And it is this unwavering self-alignment that sparks the profound, silent shift of revaluation in their perception.